one waitress, one arrogant millionaire, and a grand piano. What began as a cruel attempt to embarrass her turned into a moment that left the entire room in stunned silence, egos shattered. You won't believe how she turned the tables, armed with nothing but her talent. It was a warm Friday evening, and the soft hum of conversation drifted through the Goldfinch, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. The clinking of glasses, the gentle shuffle of servers, and the faint melodies from the corner piano wove together a refined, indulgent atmosphere. Clara Reed, a 25-year-old waitress with a quiet grace and a spark in her eye, moved fluidly between tables, balancing plates and polite smiles. To most patrons, she was just another face in uniform, but behind that calm exterior lay dreams far larger than the elegant dining room around her. Clara's true passion wasn't in serving tables, it was music. Since childhood, the piano had been her sanctuary, a place where she poured out every joy, heartache, and hope. But passion doesn't pay the bills, and long shifts at the Goldfinch were necessary stepping stones toward the music academy she yearned to attend. Few knew about her talent, only the restaurant staff, who sometimes caught her sneaking moments at the aging upright piano in the back room during breaks. That night, as the dinner rush softened, the door swung open. In strode Victor Lawson, a wealthy entrepreneur whose reputation often preceded him. Tall, sharp-dressed, and flanked by equally polished companions, Victor exuded an air of self-importance. He moved as though the restaurant belonged to him. Victor's sharp tongue and love for spectacle made even the most experienced staff stand a little taller. Clara's coworkers exchanged subtle glances. He wasn't an easy guest. Victor had a knack for pushing buttons and making the staff squirm. To Clara, he was just another table. She wasn't interested in his theatrics. But tonight wasn't going to be like any other. As Victor scanned the room, his gaze settled on Clara. Something about her made him pause, then smirk. She felt his eyes linger, heavy with curiosity. Clara brushed it off, staying focused on clearing plates and refilling glasses. But Victor wasn't done. In his mind, Clara had already been chosen as the evening's entertainment. Clara grew up in Savannah, Georgia, where dreams often felt as far away as the stars. Her mother, a single parent and dedicated nurse, worked tireless shifts to keep food on the table for Clara and her two younger brothers. Despite their humble means, music was always present in their home. Her mother's vinyl records and the out-of-tune piano gifted by a neighbor were the seeds of Clara's love for melody. That battered piano became her world. While other kids played outside, Clara sat for hours, teaching herself to play by ear. She started by mimicking songs from the radio, later challenging herself with classical pieces from secondhand music books. By the time she was a teenager, Clara was playing at church, school recitals, and community events. Her talent was undeniable, but talent alone couldn't erase the financial barriers looming over her dreams. When scholarships didn't come through and family responsibilities grew heavier, the path to a professional music career began to fade. At 18, Clara set aside her ambitions, trading concert stages for waitressing shifts. Yet, the piano never truly left her. It wasn't just a dream, it was a part of who she was. After moving to Charleston a few years ago, Clara applied at the Goldfinch, not just for the pay, but because of the sleek grand piano in the restaurant's corner. She rarely had time to play it, but knowing it was there brought her comfort. Music was still waiting for her. As Victor and his entourage settled into their seats, Clara approached, tray balanced carefully. "Scotch, the best you have," Victor ordered, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. A half-joking insult about the restaurant's selection followed, drawing laughter from his friends. Clara smiled politely, her expression composed. She took their orders, ignoring the strange energy Victor gave off. "Clara," Victor mused aloud, glancing at her name tag. "You look like someone with hidden talents." The comment caught her off guard, but she nodded politely, retreating toward the bar. She missed the knowing glances Victor exchanged with his friends, the kind of look that said trouble was brewing. The night carried on, filled with laughter and the soft chime of silverware. Clara kept moving, keeping her distance from Victor's table as much as possible. She had dealt with difficult guests before, but there was something different about him. His presence felt deliberate, almost predatory, as if he enjoyed testing boundaries. By the time appetizers arrived, Victor's antics were in full swing, though his performance was just beginning. Victor held court at his table, loudly recounting tales of his success, each story punctuated with sharp jabs at those he deemed less ambitious. His entourage laughed dutifully, while other diners exchanged irritated glances, clearly growing tired of his theatrics. Clara tried to stay focused on her tasks, weaving between tables with practiced ease. But as she returned to Victor's table with a bottle of wine, his voice sliced through the low hum of the room. "Tell me, Clara," he said, his tone louder than necessary, drawing the attention of nearby tables. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." Clara paused mid-pour, the weight of his gaze making her uneasy. She hesitated but answered carefully. "I play piano sometimes," she replied softly, hoping to keep the conversation brief. Victor's eyes lit up with amusement, and a sly smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "A pianist? How fascinating." He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass. "Why don't you give us a little performance?" Clara's hand froze over the bottle. The room seemed to quiet as the weight of his words settled in the air. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a polite laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." "Nonsense," Victor declared, waving off her protest. His voice rang out, loud enough to draw even more attention. "The piano's right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely a rising star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." Laughter rippled from his companions, clearly enjoying the impromptu show he was orchestrating. Curious glances from other diners followed, heads turning toward Clara. Her chest tightened. She could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment hovering over her. She wanted to refuse, to walk away and fade into the background. But Victor's challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at her feet, daring her to rise to the occasion or crumble. "I really shouldn't," Clara murmured, glancing at her coworkers. But even they seemed hesitant to step in. Victor leaned back, sipping his scotch with a smirk. "Ah, I see," he said, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. "All talk, no talent. That's a shame." The words struck like a slap. Clara's grip tightened around the tray, her nails pressing into her palm. She had never sought confrontation, but the way Victor dismissed her, as if she were insignificant, as if her dreams were just a joke, cut deeper than she expected. Her mother's voice echoed softly in her mind. "Never let anyone make you feel small, Clara. You're bigger than they'll ever know." A moment of silence stretched between them. Clara's eyes flickered to the grand piano in the corner, then back to Victor. His smug expression dared her to take the bait. "Fine. I'll play," she said quietly, her voice steady. A ripple of anticipation stirred the room. Conversations dimmed as Clara set down her tray and walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier, the soft click of her heels echoing in the stillness. Victor leaned back further in his chair, already grinning as if he had won whatever game he thought he was playing. Clara slid onto the piano bench. The chandelier overhead cast a soft glow, illuminating the polished keys before her. The room's eyes were fixed on her, but she kept her gaze low, focusing on the instrument. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the keys, barely brushing the cool surface. She could walk away. She could let Victor have his victory. But she didn't. Clara closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. The first notes were quiet, fragile, like a whisper testing the air. A few diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone coughed in the back. Clara pressed on, her focus narrowing. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful, delicate rendition of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody unfolded, drifting softly across the dining room. Like a thread, it wove through the air, unassuming yet steady. Her hands glided over the keys, growing bolder with each passing measure. The music swelled, filling the room with something that felt too large to contain. Each note carried fragments of her story. The sacrifices her mother made, the long nights spent practicing by candlelight, the weight of unfulfilled dreams. The chatter in the restaurant faded. One by one, diners fell silent, their attention tethered to the music. Victor, who had been whispering to his companions, stopped mid-sentence. Clara didn't look at him, but she felt the shift. The mocking undercurrent was gone, replaced by something quieter. By the time she reached the final chord, the room was utterly still. Clara sat frozen, her fingers resting lightly on the keys as the final note lingered in the air. For a breathless moment, nothing moved. Then, like a wave breaking, applause erupted across the room. It thundered, filling every corner of the restaurant with a warmth Clara hadn't anticipated. Some diners rose to their feet, clapping with such enthusiasm that it brought a sting to her eyes. Her co-workers, who had been watching anxiously, exchanged proud smiles. And Victor? Victor sat motionless, his glass hovering mid-air. His smirk was gone, replaced by something Clara couldn't quite place. She rose from the bench and returned to her station without a word, heart pounding but head high. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an artist. Victor's entourage joined the applause, their faces alight with pride as they clapped enthusiastically. But Victor himself remained seated, hands resting on the table. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something Clara couldn't quite place, a mixture of surprise and discomfort. Slowly, he raised his hands and offered a few hesitant claps. The sound was hollow, nearly drowned out by the cheers around him. But even his reluctant applause couldn't overshadow what had just happened. Clara had reclaimed her voice, and no amount of condescension could take that away. As the applause softened, the room seemed to collectively exhale. Clara rose from the piano, her knees trembling beneath her, but her posture tall and composed. She glanced around the room, and for the first time that night, truly saw the faces watching her, not as strangers or patrons, but as witnesses. Their expressions carried something different now: admiration, respect, even awe. Clara didn't look at Victor immediately. Instead, she offered a polite nod to the diners who had clapped the loudest, her lips curling into a small, quiet smile. It wasn't pride she felt, at least not entirely. It was relief. Relief that she hadn't let fear silence her. But just as she was about to turn away, her eyes found Victor's. He sat motionless, his hands clasped in front of him, his jaw tight. The confidence he had worn so boldly earlier was nowhere to be found. His face was blank, a mask of neutrality barely concealing the uncertainty beneath. "Well," Victor finally said, his voice louder than necessary as he broke the silence hanging over the room. "That was unexpected." He chuckled, though it lacked the charm he usually carried. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places." The comment landed flat. His companions exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they should laugh or remain silent. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant to smooth things over, to extend some form of olive branch. But they felt empty, like he was trying to salvage the moment without fully admitting defeat. "Thank you," Clara replied, her tone even and deliberate. There was no malice in her voice, but no warmth either. She wasn't going to let him shrink her back down. Her performance had spoken for itself. Victor shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective gaze. He gestured for another drink, desperate to regain some semblance of control. "You've got quite a gift," he muttered, his eyes flickering toward his glass. Clara nodded once, unwavering. "Everyone has a gift," she said, each word intentional. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room stilled again. Her words weren't loud or confrontational, but their impact rippled outward, impossible to ignore. Victor's usual aura of dominance faded even further. He sank a little deeper into his chair, the bravado he had so proudly worn unraveling with every second that passed. Gradually, the diners returned to their meals, though the energy in the restaurant had shifted entirely. Where there had once been the quiet hum of privilege and pretension, there was now something richer. A shared understanding. A quiet respect for the waitress who had reminded them all of the power of authenticity. Victor wasn't just humiliated, he was exposed, and no amount of charm could hide it. Clara stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. As she returned to her station, her coworkers greeted her with subtle nods and warm smiles. She still had a job to finish, but something about her had shifted. Her head was held a little higher. Her movements carried more purpose. Victor's table had grown notably quieter. His entourage, once boisterous and entertained by his antics, now avoided eye contact. Their laughter had dissolved into a subdued hum, as if unsure how to proceed. The arrogance that once filled their corner of the restaurant had vanished, replaced by an awkward silence. Clara continued her work, her steps lighter with each round through the dining room. Several patrons stopped her along the way. "You were incredible," an older woman said gently as Clara set down her coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Keep going," a man added as he signed his check. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Clara thanked them softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were validation, affirmations of everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of becoming. Victor, however, wasn't quite as gracious. As Clara approached his table with the check, he glanced up at her. His expression teetered between irritation and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said flatly, signing the receipt with a flick of his wrist. "No need to rub it in." Clara paused, her eyes steady as she met his gaze. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied calmly. "I just wanted to play." Victor had no response. He fidgeted with his drink, his confidence reduced to an awkward shuffle of papers and empty gestures. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and everyone at the table knew it. Victor scribbled his signature on the check, his pen strokes quick and indifferent. But as he passed it back, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, paused. He glanced at Clara, his eyes holding something genuine. "You were amazing, truly." The sincerity in his voice caught Clara off guard. For a brief moment, she saw something different, a flicker of humanity in a group she had written off as shallow. Clara offered a small smile. "Thank you," she replied softly, then turned and walked away. The night ended without the usual grand exit from Victor and his entourage. There were no lingering laughs, no exaggerated gestures of importance. They left quietly, slipping out into the cool Charleston night like shadows retreating from the light. Clara watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Victor anymore. Her mind was already on what came next. The tips that evening were unusually generous. By the end of her shift, she realized there was enough to cover her rent, and with a little extra left over. Enough for the piano lessons she had been postponing. As Clara locked the restaurant's doors behind her and stepped onto the quiet street, the crisp night air filled her lungs. With each breath, she felt something stir inside, something she hadn't felt in years: certainty. Clara wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist. No amount of condescending words, financial struggles, or fear could take that away. Her thoughts weren't on the night's conflict as she walked home beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. They were on the future, where her dreams suddenly felt closer than ever before. Clara sat down at the worn bench in her small apartment, her fingers gently gliding over the keys of her old upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as the grand piano at the Goldfinch, but it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, just as it always had. That night had shifted something within her. It wasn't just a fleeting victory, it was a realization. Her talent didn't need to be hidden or justified. It was hers, and it was enough. In the days that followed, news of what happened at the Goldfinch spread quietly through Charleston. Patrons who had witnessed her performance shared the story over dinner parties and coffee shop conversations. Staff whispered about it in the kitchen. A few days later, Clara's phone rang. The man on the other end introduced himself as a music producer from Nashville. He had been dining at the restaurant that night. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but he was offering something Clara had only dared to dream of. A chance to record a demo, a step forward. Clara agreed, not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening. And this time, she wasn't afraid to walk through it. For years, Clara had let fear and doubt whisper lies in her ear, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big, too impractical. But now she understood the truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The incident with Victor Lawson wasn't just a humiliating spectacle turned victory. It was a reminder. Integrity has its own kind of power. Victor, with all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish Clara's light. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced. And she silenced him with nothing but the purity of her craft. To anyone listening, Clara's story held a message. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of people like Victor Lawson, people who mask their insecurities by projecting them onto others. They thrive on diminishing others to feel powerful. But true power comes from staying rooted in who you are, and letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As Clara gently closed the lid of her piano and rested her hands on its faded wood, she smiled softly to herself. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Victor to challenge you. Take your step forward now. And if Clara's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your story could be next.